Cominciare questo nostro incontro della storia in piazza. Io sono molto contento di aver conosciuto, grazie alla storia in piazza, il professor Andrew Pettigrew e naturalmente di essermi accostato ai suoi lavori. Lui è uno studioso modernista, io mi occupo di storia contemporanea, non conoscevo prima i suoi lavori, la storia in piazza è stata un'occasione per accostarmi e dico poche parole su di lui, sul suo lavoro e sul nesso che c'è fra il tema che questa mattina sviluppiamo e il filo conduttore della storia in piazza. Allora, Andrew Pettigrew viene dall'Università di St. Andrews, che è una delle la più antica università della Scozia e una delle più antiche e prestigiose del Regno Unito, quindi ci porta intanto la voce di una parte della Gran Bretagna importante dal punto di vista degli studi modernistici. È uno dei maggiori specialisti di quella che gli inglesi chiamano riforma, che noi chiamiamo, precisando, riforma protestante, da cui è partito come tema del suo lavoro. Il cuore dell'interesse di Pettigrew è però sulla riforma protestante come fenomeno sociale, cioè sulla società europea al tempo della riforma. E quindi in particolare si è sviluppato nella direzione di come si propagano le idee della riforma, cioè quali sono gli strumenti attraverso i quali questa idea, che è destinata a essere un detonatore della storia europea, si propaga. Pubblicazioni, dipinti, teatri, canzoni, eccetera, eccetera. E infatti uno dei suoi libri importanti, che voglio qui ricordare, uno tra i tanti, è La riforma e la cultura della persuasione, come riesce a comunicare questa idea, che è un libro del 2005. Di qui l'interesse di Pettigrew si è allargato alla storia della comunicazione in quanto tale, e siccome sappiamo bene la storia della riforma è anche la storia del libro, della stampa nascente, il tema della stampa è diventato un tema fondamentale. E infatti un altro libro di Pettigrew che voglio qui citare è The Book in the Renaissance, cioè appunto il libro nel Rinascimento. È un lavoro del 2010. Cosa conta, come si diffonde, che cosa è il libro in quell'epoca. E di qui ancora il suo interesse si è allargato al tema di cosa erano e come circolavano le notizie nell'Europa moderna prima che nascesse il grande quotidiano che noi conosciamo nell'Ottocento, cioè lo strumento per eccellenza che è ancora dominante, sebbene stia arretrando o comunque debba evolversi rispetto alle sue forme originarie, che è appunto il grande quotidiano. Cosa sono? La notizia, il bisogno di notizie, questo è l'assunto che io rapidamente voglio richiamare, il bisogno di notizie nasce prima che esista quello strumento che noi conosciamo bene, che è il grande quotidiano, a partire almeno dall'Ottocento. Di qui un terzo libro di Pettigrew che voglio citare, per fortuna questo tradotto in italiano e recentemente tradotto, ed è appunto L'invenzione delle notizie, come il mondo arrivò a conoscersi, che è un libro di Einaudi, tradotto per Einaudi nel 2015, che voi trovate nella libreria là fuori. 5 secoli prima del moderno quotidiano, cosa è e come si evolve la notizia. Questo è il tema, un tema che ci porta pienamente nel cuore della storia in piazza di quest'anno, perché che vede nelle sue scaturigini proprio la questione del libro. Poi sappiamo che si evolve in tante altre direzioni, ma Gutenberg è un po' alle origini, all'inizio di questo percorso. Con questo chiudo e come voi aspetto la lezione del professor Pettigrew, che ringrazio ancora di essere venuto tra noi.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. and thank you for coming this Sunday morning. This is my first visit to Geneva, which I'm enjoying very much, but it's very possible my daughter will come and study here next year, so in some respect I'm an advance guard for the Pettigrew family. In February 2016, one of the most respected of British newspapers, The Independent, announced that it would shortly abandon its print edition. In future, the paper would be published online only. The loss of one of the United Kingdom's most respected titles naturally prompted a further round of introspection in the British press. When I first published the original English version of The Invention of News, many of the first reviewers were journalists. Naturally, they used the opportunity to offer their own reflections on the future of their profession. Time and time again, in both reviews and media interviews, we came round to this existential question. What was the future of the professional journalist in this new and hostile climate? Did journalism indeed have a future? Now, it's not difficult to find people who would answer this question in the negative. A couple of years ago, I read a well-respected book that imagined a future for news without journalists. Instead, journalism as a craft would be overtaken by the so-called citizen journalist. In an age when anyone can set up a blog and share their thoughts with the world, what precisely is the role for expensively trained news professionals? I should say at the outset that I do believe in journalism, and I do believe it has a future. The extended experiment with free expression on news stories has not been an overwhelming success, as anyone who reads the responses to news reports can easily attest. Yesterday's citizen journalist has quickly morphed into today's internet troll, ill-informed, brash, and offensive. But the question of the future of journalism goes straight to the heart of what journalism is. The term journalist actually entered the English language in the 18th century. Then it was a term of abuse. A journalist was a disreputable person, a pen for hire, someone who wrote to order for a political faction. His work consisted largely of abuse against politicians of opposing factions in England's very contentious party politics. And ministers, members of the royal family, and even the king himself were not spared. It was as if Englishmen had fought for a free press only for the right to be incredibly rude. Needless to say, much of the material that made up such writing was based on unverified rumour and willful misinterpretation, and some was simply made up. Most of England's leading writers, including Samuel Johnson, took money for this sort of work. Johnson would boast to his friends that some of his reporting of proceedings in Parliament was entirely of his own invention. He had not set foot out of his local tavern in writing up speeches he purported to have heard. Now, Johnson, of course, has a towering literary reputation, and he regarded his journalism simply as an easy way to make money. The more typical journalist of the day was the otherwise anonymous Mr. Taylor, who was paid £100 for writing in various government newspapers in 1791. We know of him only because of the entry in the Prime Minister's Secret Service accounts of this payment. Otherwise, he makes no impact whatsoever on the record. We don't even know his Christian name. Men like Mr. Taylor had no fixed position with a particular newspaper, but provided copy on demand for whoever would take it. Now, from these disreputable beginnings of journalism, we learn two things. Firstly, the very negative perception of journalism explains why it took so long for writing in the newspapers to be considered a respectable profession. In England, for instance, it was still considered that working as a journalist disqualified you from a position as a magistrate as late as the 1840s. Secondly, if this sort of writing was regarded as disreputable, it follows that there must have existed a standard of news writing against which this sort of thing was measured and found wanting. In other words, we can identify what we might see as a code of journalistic ethics in existence long before the word journalism entered the lexicon. Now, this raises a lot of questions still very pertinent to the plight of modern-day news writing. Are there essential skills to be taught? Are there principles, journalistic ethics, that need to be imbibed? I'm going today to offer my own perspective on this question by casting my mind back to the beginning of commercial news 500 years ago. Curiosity, the desire to be in the know, is pretty much a constant of human society. Arguably, it's one of the things that makes us human. The first effective and permanent news service was, like so much else, a product of the Roman Empire. These are letter tablets taken from Vindolanda, a site on Hadrian's Wall, where they were dug up in the 1980s, perfectly preserved, as you see, and an example of letter writing and news exchange. But the new service of the Roman Empire was closed. It was in practice only for the use of the state. And it was only 500 years ago that people discovered how to make money out of news. Before this, the apex of European society set up their own news networks. And in medieval Europe, news was largely the preserve of the elites. That is, the princes, the merchants, and the church. Of these three, Europe's governments, princes, and town councils had by far the most difficult time creating a news service. The church had a network of pilgrims crisscrossing the continent on whom they could rely to take news with them. Merchants, particularly big international merchants, had established firms with branch offices in other places, and their agents there would write back with the news. For princes, it was far more difficult. They had no natural news networks, particularly until the establishment in the 16th century of permanent diplomatic representation. So princes often found themselves turning for merchants for news, particularly the ubiquitous Italian merchants. And it was the Italian merchants who generated the first commercial news service. They had their origins in their own correspondence networks. And in the 15th century, imaginative entrepreneurs began to explore how such a service could be commercialized. The first newsman offered a weekly digest provided on a regular basis to a small number of subscribing customers. Each subscriber received exactly the same text. So if the Duke of Urbino was subscribing to one of these services, he would hear in the news himself spoken about in the third person. The Duke of Urbino did this. In the course of the 16th century, the avvisi, as these manuscript pamphlets became known, became an established part of the news network, first in Italy, then throughout Europe. Here's an example from the famous Fugger archive in Augsburg. They also developed a very distinctive character for their presentation of news. Each report was short, normally no more than 1 or 2 sentences. They offered a bold recitation of fact without editorial comment. And this style, fact not opinion, becomes the gold standard for news. These avvisi were amazingly persistent. For anyone who could afford a subscription, and they were expensive, they remained the most reliable source of news until the 18th century. That is, long after print had been invented. They were published and circulated in France until the eve of the French Revolution. They were also, as we will see, deeply influential on the style of the newspaper invented in the 17th century. First, however, the avvisi faced a very significant challenge from a very different sort of news. It was the 16th century when news first began to be published in large quantities in printed form. This was a very significant moment for the publishing industry. It's not always realized how close the new invention of print came to failing. Gutenberg's new process, printing with movable type, was a technological marvel, and at first everybody wanted to have a part of it. But it turned out it was a very different thing to sell one copy of a manuscript to a single customer and somehow to dispose of 300 or 400 copies of the same book. The result was oversupply, unsold stock, and for many, bankruptcy. The normative experience of the first printers in the 15th century was bankruptcy. The print world contracted abruptly in the difficult years between 1485 and 1520. And here I'm showing one of the series of slides which I developed to illustrate this point. The normal narrative of print, which historians are used to, suggests print spreading very easily, very fast. But what we actually see here is a significant contraction to a small number of very large commercial centers: Paris, Venice, Lyon, Augsburg. In other words, print survives by retrenching into these places. What this proved was that the existing model of print wasn't working. Rather like the digital technologies in the 1990s, print desperately needed a reboot. To monetize the invention required new types of books that appealed to new customers. The established customers of the manuscript age were simply not sufficiently numerous. The key moment came with the explosion of print that followed Luther's attack on the church in 1517. Suddenly, everybody wanted to hear about this extraordinary man and his outspoken views. Luther's works were soon in the hands of men and women who had never previously bought books, and in huge numbers. The printers made profits. The publishing world was transformed in fundamental ways by this development. Firstly, we see a general reorientation of the book world from south to north. To this point, Italy had been both the center of book production and the center of the news world. Gradually now, influence passed to the societies of North and Western Europe, to Germany, to England, to the Netherlands. Secondly, publishers now had the key of how to make money from print, and they used this knowledge. As the fires of the Reformation controversy receded, printers sought to keep their new customers by offering them other books as cheap and short as these Reformation pamphlets. And one of the ways to do this was to continue to feed the new market for news. From the middle of the 16th century, the market for news publications grew very rapidly. News was published like this, in pamphlet form, or as single sheet broadsheets. The pamphlets were much more numerous. short works celebrating royal visits and royal marriages, reporting the military triumphs of the local ruler, or faraway wars against the Ottoman Turks. Broadsheets like this, single sheets printed on one side only, concentrated on news that had a highly visual element, notable crimes, such as this one, strange animals or human misbirths, most of all, celestial apparitions, strange things happening in the sky. This was an age when all people scanned the heavens for signs of God's purpose. Broadsheet news offered both a graphic manifestation of these events and an interpretation. These are just a couple of tables which demonstrate this increase in the amount of news, both in pamphlet and broadsheet form, particularly through the century. And you see here also how much stronger this is in the Netherlands and Germany than in southern Europe. When you express the total news market as a proportion of the vernacular printing, it's clear that Germany, with around 8%, and the Netherlands with 7%, are streets ahead of other markets. Now, both these new forms of news, the broadsheet and the pamphlet, drew in stylistic terms on the success of the Reformation literature. The pamphlets were generally 8 pages long, like many of Luther's publications. The broadsheets always gave the top half to an illustration and the bottom to explanation. And they were also very different in character from the manuscript Avisi. The Avisi, as we've seen, had short, staccato reports provided by an informed professional news gatherer, offered without comment or explanation. Because they appeared regularly every week, they often reported on events, the real importance of which was not quite clear. Pamphlets were very different, usually a continuous text devoted to a single event and written after the event had concluded. They were able, for this reason, to offer both context and interpretation, all with the benefit of hindsight. Now, these news pamphlets and broadsheets were not published by professional newsmen. Many of their authors were clergy, drawing moral lessons from terrible crimes or natural disaster. So news reaches the end of the 16th century with 2 distinct traditions of reporting. One, the manuscript Avisi, providing regular bulletins for subscribing customers. For members of Europe's ruling elites, these manuscript newsletters were indispensable. But for the majority of the new reading public, they would have made little sense. Who was Cardinal Barberini? What did it matter if he'd set off for Rimini? Was this good news or bad news? People who didn't know needed the pamphlets who explained it all to them. Now, this contrasting style provides the context for the birth of the newspaper at the beginning of the 17th century. And this is a copy of the very first, at the title page of the very first surviving newspaper. It's no surprise that with 2 contrasting styles, the newspapers opted emphatically for the wholly factual approach of the Avisi. In fact, they were often produced by the same people. Johannes Carolus, who was the proprietor of the first newspaper, already had an existing manuscript news service. This, like the book, took off very quickly. Spurred by the long-running drama of the 30 Years' War, by the middle of the 17th century, newspapers had been established in more than 30 German towns. They were very popular, but they were also a very difficult read for people who took out subscriptions. They crammed as much news as they could into an 8-page pamphlet. In the Dutch case, they used an even more economical single sheet printed on both sides. The news was, much like the Avisi, presented in a terse sentence or two without much comment. Each report headlined by the place from which it came. Here we have from Hamburg, from Breslau, from Rome, and each time with the date, from Rome on the 27th of January. And these reports were taken virtually verbatim from the commercial manuscript newsletters. The sole journalistic activity was to decide what reports to include. Now, it's hard to fall in love with these early newspapers, but they're exceptionally important for development of what became journalistic ethics. The traditional readers of the Avisi might not have demanded a high style, but they cared deeply that the news they received was reliable. They knew that the news publications published as pamphlets were often deeply partisan. Mostly, they broadcast only news favorable to their own prince or their own country. Now, that might be good for morale, and it may be what people wanted to hear, but it was little use for those in the circles of decision-making who relied on accurate news for making policy. Now, the newspapers inherited this very careful tradition. Where a story was yet to be confirmed or its reliability was in doubt, the language of the news reflected this. It is reported from Geneva, they would say. Rumors come from Rome. It is said that the Duke of Orleans has been wounded in battle, but this cannot yet be confirmed. Publishers got very irritated if they published a news report which turned out later not to be true. These newspapers were the editorial creation of a single individual. The publisher received incoming reports, redacted them into a text, and dispatched it to the print shop. Very often they were also their own business manager, finding customers, organizing a distribution network, collecting subscriptions. Now, the news, of course, had to come from somewhere, and very often the publishers simply took subscriptions to the manuscript Avisi and transcribed it for a print version. But they also began to establish their own networks of correspondence. And we see a steady growth of these through the 17th century. In the early papers, such as the one I've shown you here, you would have maybe no more than 5 or 6 different places of correspondence. And they were mostly headlined from the major news hubs, Venice, Vienna, Prague, Cologne. Yet 50 years later, by the 1670s, issues might contain as many as 25 separate reports. And in addition to the major news capitals, they came from much smaller places. Thus, in addition to numerous reports from London, English reports could also be dispatched from smaller places like Portsmouth, Plymouth, or Cowes. Maintaining a network like this was extremely expensive. The Dutch newspapers, like the one I'm showing you here, had a large circulation, and the Dutch also received a decent additional income from advertising, in which they were pioneers. But elsewhere in Europe, it was prohibitively expensive to establish such a network of correspondence. Many of the German newspapers were published in relatively small territories. So how was it possible to make a newspaper pay? How was it possible to sustain such a venture? Well, there were different strategies. In England, the first papers established outside London simply copied news from the London papers. The German papers often received subsidies from the local prince, either directly as cash or indirectly in orders for bulk buys of their paper. But such financial dependence discouraged editorial independence. All over Europe, newsmen took a very cautious approach to domestic news, to publishing news about their own place of publication. Now, it's now almost more than 40 years since the German sociologist Jürgen Habermas laid out his vision of what he referred to as the rise of the public sphere. His vision of the public sphere is firmly centered on the literate commercial publics of Europe's major trading cities and their coffee houses, the natural home of customers for Europe's first newspapers. It was in such places, Habermas believed, there existed the condition for a rational, critical, and genuinely open discussion of political issues. To Habermas, the public sphere was naturally oppositional. By encouraging open debate, the public sphere also existed, he believed, in tension with what he thought of as the government's natural instinct for secrecy, to make policy behind closed doors. Now, Habermas's thesis has been extremely influential, but it's very hard to see how it can be applied to the first newspapers. As we've seen, most early newspapers were not opposition organs. They were deeply supportive of the state. The Paris Gazette was a cheerleader for the monarchy, and the Dutch newspapers generally kept silent on local politics. In London, newspaper proprietors meekly accepted Prime Minister Walpole's lucrative embrace. In the last years of the 18th century, the going rate to purchase the support of a newspaper seems to have been £300 a year. This is the sum paid by Prime Minister William Pitt to gain the support of the Times. But it would be wrong to think that newspapers only supported government policy if they were paid to. It was, throughout this period, overwhelmingly in the interests of newspapers to be friendly to the local power. This was partly to ensure their own livelihoods against disruption or closure. It's also the case that a generally supportive stance or ignoring local politics was likely to conform to the beliefs of their own readership. Writing of the origins of a provincial press in the three industrial cities of Manchester, Sheffield, and Leeds, historian Donald Reid states plainly that most provincial newspapers in 18th century England were either placid supporters of local authorities or non-political, which amounts to very much the same thing. The same could be said of most newspaper cultures in continental Europe, and indeed it has been the tradition for local newspapers in many places right through to the end of the 20th century that they stay neutral in political matters. Now, the large amount of money dispersed to secure editorial support in 18th century London reflects one critical change in English newspapers in this period: the engagement with domestic politics and the rise of opinion. Opinion made its way into the newspapers via weekly advocacy pamphlets popularized by writers like Daniel Defoe. Now, this was not universally greeted as a great leap forward for newspaper culture. In plunging into partisan politics, newspapers compromised one of their earliest guiding principles. 17th century newspapers, as we have seen, made a virtue of their determination to offer their readers the pure, unvarnished truth, expecting readers to supply their own opinions. This was prudent, but it also reflected the strength of an early idea of journalistic ethics. Such standards obviously became far more difficult to maintain when newspapers were in local competition with other newspapers, as they were in London. Here, the papers of the 18th century delighted in exposing each other's errors, heedless that to do so undoubtedly damaged the credibility of the industry as a whole. You could not criticize one newspaper without them thinking that all newspapers committed the same sins. By the end of the 18th century, the engagement in politics, not only in England but in France and then in the new American colonial newspapers, effected a radical change in the character of the newspaper market. And in cities with multiple news organs, newspapers spoke increasingly to an audience of the like-minded. That Tories bought Tory newspapers, Whigs bought Whig newspapers, a development we can recognize in the way in which TV channels have spoken to their own audiences in the early 21st century. This debasement or degeneration of the newspapers continued apace in the last years of the 18th century. In England, newspapers came up with a new development, the scandal sheet. The model of this brave new world was the Morning Post. From the beginning, it assumed that readers wished to be entertained as much as informed, and its runaway success inspired many imitators. The success of the scandal sheets in London lay in realizing that the Habermasian principle that governments have a natural instinct for secrecy was very often the opposite of the truth. We've seen that from the 15th century onwards, princes and town councils went to enormous trouble to put information into the public domain. Whereas journalists have, from their very first days, realized that their real power lies not in what they publish, but what they choose not to publish. This is a constant of journalistic activity, but 18th century London was the only place where such power was precisely monetized. And the system was called selling paragraphs. A paper would obtain a story about a society figure or member of the aristocracy. The victim would then be offered the opportunity to suppress the story in return for a fee. Should the publication go ahead, there would be further opportunity to place a rebuttal, again in return for a fee. This was a conscienceless trade, but the practice became epidemic. This descent into scandal completed the degeneration of the newspaper ideal in 18th century London. At this stage, it was not entirely clear how the trade of news would recover. Newspapers found a partial redemption in the 19th century, the age when technological innovation and the growth of a mass literature at last combined to create a true mass market, any fully commercialized market for news. Commercial independence at last created a degree of editorial independence from government, if not from powerful proprietors who often saw ownership of a paper as a means to establish their own place in the power structure. The birth of a mass media also made journalism as a profession both attractive and respectable. But it was only in the 20th century that journalism completed this journey towards professional respectability, when journalism was both studied and taught for the first time. The great theorist of this new journalism was the American journalist and social thinker Walter Lippmann. In a seminal work of 1922, Lippmann set out the responsibilities of the new professional journalist. They were to organize and explain. Confronting the complexity of modern society, Lippmann doubted the ability of the new citizens to make sense of events. Journalists, in his view, would provide the key to understanding, mediating between the complexity of politics and the limited intelligence of the public. This gatekeeper function, as it became known, proved immensely alluring to a newly emerging professional class of trained journalists, reinforced by the rugged biographies of the 20th century generation of star reporters, such as Martha Gellhorn, Walter Schirra, and the war correspondent, of which Ernest Hemingway was briefly one. Now, for all their success, it was actually in war reporting that the tendency of reporters to offer regime-friendly interpretations actually became more acute and arguably most damaging. The journalist as cheerleader and embedded patriot. But it does not require war or great events to bring out an instinct on the part of those reporting the news to shape and organize input, often in ways very friendly to government. The most profound development in the news industry of the last 2 centuries has been the increased attention devoted to domestic politics, which, as I've explained, virtually a no-go area in the first age of commercial news. It is here that the gatekeeper function, articulated by Walter Lippmann, has been most profoundly organizing, and would someone argue, an ethical principle. Lippmann was talking about the newspapers, but the gatekeeper function also made a seamless transition to the age of television, reinforced by the small number of outlets, such as the BBC in the UK and the 3 American networks, which were competitors in some respects, but in others an intellectual cartel. The greatest power of the newspapers and these great television networks was to decide what was and what was not news. Now, this aspect of journalism, the decision as to what is newsworthy and to be shared with the public, is part of the everyday task of manufacturing the package to be described as news, but it's seldom problematized in textbooks on media studies, where the state is invariably presented as the greatest threat to press freedom, sometimes joined in the dock by the newspaper proprietor. Now, this seems to me to underplay the agency of individual journalists. There's any number of reasons why journalists do not report what they know. Some of these reasons are perfectly proper and show a decent ethical restraint, a need to protect sources, sensitivity to the privacy and potential distress of people not noticeably normally in the public eye, though that sensitivity has been much reduced in recent years. But tactics, political partisanship, and careerism also play their part in why journalists choose not to report the news. It may seem a perverse observation to make in an era like ours with 24-hour news, but it seems to me that the greatest power of journalism today lies not in what they report, but where they choose to keep silent. In the United States, the greatest and most innovative news market since the 19th century, the gatekeeper function in the American press has almost always been exercised to the benefit of government. The refusal to embarrass authority is very deeply ingrained and is seen most dramatically in reluctance to report health events which are patently relevant to a president's competence in office. Though this represents, in my view, a very narrow view of journalistic ethics. I offer here 2 pictures, one on the left as John Kennedy as he liked to be seen, and the other as the semi-invalid that he actually was. This narrow view of journalistic ethics, once again, is partly driven by economics, a desire on the one hand not to offend its own readership, and on the other, the need to cultivate a working relationship with powerful people who ultimately control access to important broadcasting licenses. This recognition of journalistic complicity in the restraints of reporting brings a rather different perspective to current debates about free speech. It suggests that the debate about free speech, which has raged in the United States following the WikiLeaks and Snowden, and in the United Kingdom with the Leveson report, it suggests to me that this debate about free speech is rather more a convenient rallying cry than a real point of contention. The real battle is not the inviolate freedom of fearless reporting, but the right to entertain, and the limits of decorum and taste in the delivery of that entertainment. And this is an example of the most egregious form of that reporting, when the phone of murder victim Millie Dowler was hacked by one of the UK's most popular newspapers. In this respect, we can see that the news market has now come full circle since the 16th century. In that earlier period, the intrusion of entertainment into news through raucous and sensational pamphlets seemed to be the greatest threat to the integrity of news. To be boring was the guarantee of respectability and truthfulness. Today, to be boring is the kiss of death. Now, entertainment represents the best chance of attracting and retaining a following in an age where so much news content is available for free. Witness here the outstanding success of the Daily Mail online, which has embraced a celebrity culture for which its print ancestor would have had little sympathy, and in consequence, it's now the world's most consulted online newspaper. The Mail is now, in effect, two newspapers, when in the editorial columns they fulminate against the degeneration of society, and in their online version they provide multiple examples of that degeneration for entertainment. Taking a long perspective, the reporting of news can be said to have fallen into three main periods. There are, first of all, the 5 centuries, which I've discussed in my book, a multimedia cacophony of pamphlets, broadsheets, and the first newspapers, but also conversation, singing, public debate. A lot of news was still oral. It's arguable that newspapers were the least functional part of this environment. I think it's this multimedia environment that we're recreating in the digital age. The intervening period, the long 19th century, the golden age of the newspaper, turns out to be quite brief. Yet it's this interlude which largely established the historical context in which news is discussed today. In this age of rapid media change, it's very reassuring that historians like me, unlike 15th century astrologers or modern day economists, are not required to foretell the future. But taking a historical perspective, looking back, for instance, to the last great media shift from manuscript to print 500 years ago, one can say that such events are always accompanied by a great deal of false prophecy, much of it by interested parties who have invested very heavily in their predictions coming true. It was true of the first printers, and it's true also of the first boosters of the internet. Consumers, on the other hand, adapt very smoothly to media change. By and large, they embrace the new technology without abandoning the old. So much of the anxiety about technological shift is on the producer's side, forced to make difficult investment decisions and sometimes rather testy if consumers don't fall into line. Put in the context of the history of news, I foresee a long future for the book. I foresee a long future for print, and also for professional journalism, though it's not necessarily the case that the two will be in the same place. But I think it would not be a bad thing if a very present-orientated profession like journalism paused occasionally to take the lessons of history. Thank you very much.
Grazie a Pettigrew per questo bel volo su 5 secoli di storia. Noi di Storia in Piazza amiamo pensare che il futuro ha un cuore antico e il professor Pettigrew ha interpretato perfettamente questa filosofia della nostra iniziativa. Grazie a tutti.